Good morning, Crossroads members and guests. It is a beautiful day out of my house and a great day to go back to our study in Luke, which we took a little hiatus from in order to celebrate the Easter week and the holidays that we love so much. But it's time to get back to finishing a study that we started some time ago, and that being a complete verse-by-verse study of the Gospel of Luke. Now, where we left off, Jesus had been speaking in chapter 13 some pretty harsh things to the Pharisees and talked quite a bit about hell, about suffering, and basically got to the point of defining hell as plenty of misery and the weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. Now he turns the corner a little bit and we get a glimpse of him speaking of heaven. Jesus spoke of hell more than any other figure in the Bible, but he also promised heaven and heavenly rewards. So we see that Jesus was not afraid to speak of hell, and in fact did quite a bit of it. And eventually says, "You shall be thrown out." Spurgeon said this: "There are some ministers who never mention anything about hell. I heard of a minister who once said to his congregation, 'If you do not love the Lord Jesus Christ, you will be sent to that place which it is not polite to mention.'" And Spurgeon's opinion was this: he ought not to have been allowed to preach again, I am sure, if he cannot use plain words. In Luke 13:29, "They will come from the east and the west, from the north, from the south, and sit down in the kingdom of God." That's very revealing. He told his audience that there would be many from all over the world, from many nations, together with God in his kingdom. This was a shock to the Jewish people of his day because they had been taught that salvation was for the Jews and not the Gentiles, period. They assumed that this great messianic banquet would have no Gentiles in it, and that all Jews would be there. Jesus corrected both mistaken ideas. These few words of Jesus tell us a little something about what heaven is like. It is a place of rest. We get to sit down. Just that part is so comforting, to sit down in heaven and be in a place of good company, to sit and enjoy the friendship of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the prophets in heaven. It's a place with people from all over the earth, east, west, north, the south. They will come to heaven. He says it's a certain place and that they will come. And when Jesus says it will happen, it will happen. The idea of people coming from all over the earth, I remember as a young man, and my first trip out of the country, which is to do some music ministry in England. And it was my first experience of seeing and interacting with people who were completely different, from a place with completely different architecture, spoke in English, of course, but with the accent, and then all the other international folks that gather around London. And we were there having a great time of ministry, but in the back of my mind, that was my first kind of shock that, man, Jesus loved the world. And of course, since then, I've been to many places out of the country and still in awe of all the Christians in all of the world, and speaking so many different languages, that "for God so loved the world" has come to mean a great deal to me. Again with Spurgeon, I just love the guy. He says this: "But ye shall hear those loved voices again. Ye shall hear those sweet voices once more. Ye shall yet know that those whom you loved have been loved by God." Would not that be a dreary heaven for us to inhabit, where we should be alike unknowing and unknown? I would not care to go to such a heaven as that. I believe that heaven is a fellowship of the saints, and that we shall know one another when we're there. And that's a beautiful promise, and something that's very important, because a lot of people just somehow think they're going to be isolated in a wonderful place, not knowing anybody. You know, who wants to go to a heaven where everybody's a stranger and you can't recognize your own husband, wife, or kids? So relax. It's going to be a place where we sit down and fellowship with people we love and people we have respected from history. And then he says, and you yourselves thrust out. He reminded the Jewish listeners that just as the Gentiles' racial identity was no automatic barrier to getting into heaven, it was for the Jew to understand that their racial identity was no guarantee of the kingdom. Indeed, they're last who will be first. There are first who will be last. And he reminded them of the humility of the kingdom, humility in heaven, and reminds those that are coming in that I think there's going to be a lot of surprises in heaven. I know we all have our opinion about some people who won't be in heaven, and then we're going to have to fellowship with them when we get to heaven, because somewhere along the line they were forgiven for their sins. They were forgiven for all the things that they had done unfairly to people, and all of the times they blasphemed. There's going to be surprises. All who are last will be first, or all who are first will be last, is not what he's saying. It's not a universal law, but it's just what we expect. We might think some deeply religious person, or that all pastors or all ministers in some way are going to get front row seats in heaven. And it's just saying that those of us who have more rewards on earth may have less rewards in heaven, and those with less rewards on earth may have more rewards in heaven. So there'll be surprises in the kingdom of God. Those who are very prominent in this world may have to be humbled as they enter into the kingdom. But for those who are last that shall be first, it's a wonder of grace. It's be very typical of God's character to be tremendously forgiving and gracious and generous and kind. In verses 31 through 33, on that very day, some Pharisees came saying to him, "Get out and depart from here, for Herod wants to kill you." And Jesus' reply is, "You go tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected. Nevertheless, I must journey today, tomorrow, and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem." So they come with apparently, and there's two sides to this particular coin. Get out and depart from here, for Herod wants to kill you. Now, this has it could be the intimidation factor of the Pharisees wanting to scare Jesus away, or it could be simply showing that there were those who wanted to protect him, that were aware of the plotting of Herod. An example would be Nicodemus, who was born again and yet a Pharisee, that perhaps there was a small group that wanted to warn him. But by this time, Jesus knew what Herod was up to and what he was going to be doing. And so I saw this many years ago, and saw a friend use this in his notes. But William Barclay from the Talmud, the Jewish sacred book, there were 7 different types of Pharisees, and I find this interesting. One was the shoulder Pharisee, who wore all his good deeds and righteousness on his shoulder for everyone to see. Okay, but you think of the pins and stripes and bars on a military man's coat. The weighty little Pharisee, who always intended to do good deeds but could always find a reason to put it off. There was the bruised or bleeding Pharisee, who was so holy that he would turn his head away from every woman he would see in public, and so was therefore bumping into things, tripping, and injuring himself. I'm serious. The humpbacked Pharisee, who was so humble that he walked bent over and barely lifting his feet so everyone could see how humble he was. The always counting Pharisee, who was always counting up his good deeds, believing that if he did that, he put God in debt to him for all the good he'd done. Someone who's a true bargain hunter with God. If I do thus and so, God owes me. That's a position that people take today, so that when then trial and problems come into their lives, they're sort of stuck with this idea that God, you owe me better than that. I don't deserve that. And that mentality, that error in theology, sets people up for a great deal of distrust of God. And on other occasions, and on future occasions, I'll deal more specifically for that. Then there's the fearful Pharisee, who did good because he was terrified that God would strike him with judgment if he did not. And there are some people who fear God beyond what they need in the following is the God-fearing Pharisee, who really loved God and did good deeds just to please the God he loved. And if you've got to be a leader, if you've got to be a Christian who displays their life and belief, you want to be that one. Now, back to something I chuckled about a few minutes ago concerning Herod. Jesus says, go tell that fox that I got work to do. Go tell that fox that I'll come in and out of Jerusalem as I please. I've got a few days' work ahead of me. I know you're plotting, but according to some, the idea behind calling someone a fox was to describe them as a cunning but weak leader. It was used in contrast with, say, a more majestic animal, as in a lion. To the Jew, the fox was the symbol of three things. First, it was regarded as the slyest of all animals. Second, it was regarded as one of the most destructive animals, and thus we have the little illustration of the fox in the hen house. And third, it was the symbol of a worthless and insignificant man. So Jesus it was a jab, to say the very, very least. Herod was also an example, I believe, of one of the first who would be last, mentioned in Luke 13. I have my doubts whether he's going to make it past the judgment seat. But at that time, he sat in complete power and authority. He ruled under the Romans. He was a puppet king, and his authority would not last long. And so Jesus goes on and says, he's got a job description. Behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected. Jesus wanted Herod to know that he would continue his work to its complete conclusion, and Jesus is saying, I'm not afraid of you, and he wanted him to know it. Be perfected actually has the idea of to reach the goal. Jesus knew that before long he would reach the goal of the third day, and the resurrection would be his. Clark said, I shall then, he's paraphrasing for Jesus, I shall then have accomplished the purpose for which I came into the world, leaving nothing undone, which the counsel of God designed me to complete. What a beautiful paraphrase. Then Jesus said, it cannot be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem. And that means he probably spoke with a touch of irony. Of course, there were many times when a prophet was killed outside of Jerusalem, but there's a special irony in the fact that the Messiah of Israel, the very Messiah, would be rejected and executed in that city. So now comes something very, very deep and important. And I'm going to hopefully not bore you with some historic dialogue. Jesus now in verse 34 and 35 laments over the city that is about to reject him. And it's more than a lament. It is an emotional episode in the life of Christ. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. This is so tender. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings. But you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. And assuredly, I say to you, you shall not see me until the time comes when you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Jesus spoke with very special feeling, and the repeating of the name signifies emphasis and a great deal of depth. It's sort of whenever you see something repeated, like the deep emotion Jesus felt saying, Martha, Martha, at the tomb of Lazarus, or Saul, Saul, at the point of his calling in Acts 9. It was deeply, deeply personal and in depth. This deep love that Jesus had for Jerusalem was with the full knowledge of the city's sins. The one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. He's not whitewashing them. He knows what they've been guilty of. And despite that, he pleaded with the city to turn from the destruction that was soon going to come upon it. And this is where it's important that we connect the raw history of Jerusalem, namely 70 AD, because I believe that Jesus is weeping and lamenting over Jerusalem because he sees in his prophetic way what was coming. When he said, how often I wanted to gather your children together, Jesus wanted to protect, he wanted to nourish and cherish his people, the Jews, even as a mother bird protects young chicks. Now, the image of the hen in the Greek is simply bird. It's translated hen because that image is so strong, that protective image of a hen, calling to her brood and gathering them together. But it shows us that Jesus had a deep, deep, deep desire to make the people of Jerusalem safe. He wanted to make them happy. He wanted to make them part of a blessed community in the nation they were called to be. He wanted to promote their health and growth. He wanted them to know his love, and this could only happen if they came to him when he called. This opens up a whole nother door of understanding the love of Jesus. G. Campbell Morgan called this a display of the mother heart of God, which is a whole different subject and very deep and very satisfying to look at the love of God in such a way. The words, how often I wanted, are a subtle indication that Luke knew Jesus had visited Jerusalem many times before, as clearly recounted in the Gospel of John, even though Luke only mentions this last visit. But you were not willing. The problem was not the willingness of Jesus to rescue and protect them. The problem was that they were not willing. Therefore, the predicted destruction would come upon them. Your house is left to you desolate. These are words that predict the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the things that Jesus sees. The Roman army in 70 AD. And you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. There are many renditions, interpretations of this, but Jesus here is revealing something that's really not clarified in the Bible, but he's indicating that the Jewish people are always welcome to recognize him as Messiah. And blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord refers to his second coming. And it's been said this by Adam Clark, till after the fullness of the Gentiles is brought in, when the word of life shall again be sent unto you, then will ye rejoice and bless and praise him that cometh in the name of the Lord with full and final salvation for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Somewhere in that mix in his second coming, there will be an opportunity. Again, this is an interpretation, but he has also clarified that there's no difference between Jew and Gentile. So there's this tension of God's love for Israel and wanting to give them every chance, and over against the ideas of when the second coming comes, that's the judgment, and we're all done, the votes are in. So that's something worth talking about, worth studying together. But remember, Paul does say in Romans 11:26, and so all Israel will be saved. I'm not one to believe that God is finished with Israel, and it's one of the reasons we visit there and enjoy studying about it, because I don't think it's off God's table. Now, I want to read to you something about what Jesus was seeing, what it was that made him cry and lament so deeply, so heartfelt. Jesus loved Israel. He preached throughout all of it on foot. He loved Israel. He loved Jerusalem, loved the people of Jerusalem, a beautiful, beautiful city of God. So what was it that he saw that made him cry? Well, just a few decades after the resurrection and all the warnings that Jesus gave, came a time for the destruction of Jerusalem. And it was exercised as a siege by the Roman general Titus. Titus would eventually become the emperor, and the siege happened in 70 AD and was the decisive event of the first Jewish-Roman war. The Roman army capturing the city and destroying both it and the temple. The Roman army, led by Titus, and a second in command by the name of Tiberius Julius Alexander, besieged and conquered the city of Jerusalem. I'm reading to you now. Which had been controlled by Judean rebel factions since 66. So in these years following, these decades following the resurrection, the zealots basically took over. Judas was a zealot. People that wanted to fight the Romans and that passed on the message of Jesus. Remember all the times that we reminded you and that Jesus reminded his followers that he was not there as a warrior king. He was there to bring peace. Well, their refusal to accept a Messiah of peace who would have been doing something completely different than leading riots. There were Jerusalem riots in 66, and they called it the leadership, the Judeo Provisional Government, and that was formed to fight the sieges that had come from the Romans during that time, which the Romans had attacked on other occasions. The siege of the city began on April 14th, 70 AD, 3 days before the beginning of Passover that year. That's very important to remember. The siege lasted for about 4 months. It ended in August AD 70 with the burning and destruction of the second temple, Herod's temple. The Romans then entered and destroyed the lower city. And there is an arch called the Arch of Titus that still stands today as a monument in the city of Rome, celebrating the conquest of Jerusalem. Now, it says this: despite early successes in repelling the Roman sieges, the zealots fought amongst themselves. and they lacked proper leadership, resulting in poor discipline and training and preparation for the battles that were to follow. At one point, now get this, at one point they destroyed the food stocks in the city, a drastic measure thought to have been undertaken, perhaps in order to enlist a merciful God's intervention on behalf of the besieged Jews. Talk about bargaining with God. Or as a strategy to make the defenders more desperate, supposing that that was necessary in order to repel the Roman army. Let's starve our own army and make them more angry, make them tough. Titus began his siege, as I said, a few days before Passover, and they surrounded the city with 3 legions on the western side and the Mount of Olives side. And according to Jerusalem, from Josephus, the historian standpoint, Jerusalem was packed. Jerusalem was thronged with people who had come to celebrate Passover. We know that from past studies. Every Passover, the place was just packed. The thrust of the siege began in the west at the third wall north of the Jaffa Gate, and the Jewish defenders were split into factions. They were so split in these groups, and you can imagine with the seven different kinds of Pharisees and this group and that group, that one of the factions, this is inside the city of Jerusalem, one of the factions murdered the leader of another faction of defenders, and they were completely ineffective in their leadership. So after several failed attempts to breach or scale the walls of the fortress of Antonia. Now, when you have been to Israel and been to Jerusalem, this all makes sense because these structures are still there for the most part. The Romans finally launched a secret attack, overwhelming the sleeping zealots, and took the fortress by late July. Now, let me jump ahead here. Josephus sort of describes the scene because he was there. He was a Jew. He was hired as a historian to keep record. The Romans were very, very, very meticulous about keeping records of their conquests, of their defeats. And even though Josephus was a Jew, he was moonlighting on the side, working with the Romans. Some would call him a traitor. Others would call him a knowledgeable spectator in this. But he describes the scene. As the legions charged in, neither persuasion nor threat could check their impetuosity. Passion alone was in command. Crowded together around the entrances, many were trampled by their friends. Many fell among the still hot, smoking ruins of the colonnades and died as miserably as the defeated. As they neared the sanctuary, they pretended not even to hear Caesar's commands and urged the men in the front to throw in more firebrands. The partisans were no longer in a position to help. Everywhere was slaughter and flight. Most of the victims were peaceful citizens, weak and unarmed, butchered wherever they were caught. Round the altar, the heaps of corpses grew higher and higher, while down the sanctuary steps poured a river of blood, and the bodies of those killed at the top slithered to the bottom. We'll have a teaching on those steps. You'd cry too, people. If you had this kind of love for a people that you were called to. And Josephus claims that 1.1 million people were killed during this siege, which of the majority were Jewish. Remember, it was crowded for Passover. They let all the Passover people in, that were milling around, and then just before Passover started, they started the siege. Josephus attributes this to the celebration of Passover, which he uses as rationale for the vast number of people present in his death toll. Armed rebels, as well as the frail citizens, were put to death. All of Jerusalem's remaining citizens became Roman prisoners. After the Romans killed the armed, the elderly, there were 97,000 people left. Thousands were forced to become gladiators and eventually expired in the arena. Many others were forced to assist in the building of the Colosseum they would die in. Those under 17 years of age were sold into slavery, and Titus and his soldiers, now get this, imagine this, celebrated victory upon their return to Rome by parading the menorah and the table of bread of God's presence through the streets. Up until these items had only ever been seen by the high priest because they were in the Holy of Holies of the temple. And this event, as I mentioned before, is memorialized still today by the Arch of Titus. Now, what this means, folks, is look at the times that we're living in. Does it make you feel anything? Do you feel for children who can't go to school? Do you feel for the families that have lost their jobs due to this horrible pandemic that we're experiencing right now? And the facts that it's global. See, some of us just go by these feelings of Jesus, this weeping and lament, and we go, oh, isn't that tender? What a wonderful Hallmark card that would make. But you're talking about the real thing. Jesus, in his prophetic foresight, saw all this. And it made him cry. And when we look to our nation, there's room for lament. There's room for emotion that drives us to prayer. People are thinking about God. They're asking simple questions. You know, this isn't something that can be regulated by any organization, any political party, and can only be regulated by the intervention of God. And in that, I believe that people all over the world are thinking more globally. They're thinking they have less control. Great countries have no control. Communities have no control. We just have to wait and trust in the Lord. But it should activate that emotion, activate that compassion, activate prayer. And I believe that this has been, allowed of God to just show us how small we really are compared to this tiny little bug. Now, we'll get through this. It'll come, it'll go, but it leaves in its tracks suffering and death. The funeral requests are already beginning to come in. People ask me all the time, do you know anybody that's died from this virus? And the answer is yes. And we're all connected in this, thank God. But our connection through Christ is the most important. And as you look at our world, try to think of what it was like for Jesus to talk about this destruction and to actually see it in the Spirit and weep over it. And I pray we have eyes to see, spiritual eyes to see, like Jesus had the spiritual eyes to see what was coming, spiritual insight and discernment. And it caused him to act. It caused him to lament, to weep, and to pray. And I pray that we would have just some of those feelings and direct them to those in our community who don't know the Lord. Direct that compassion to those who are in need, and to direct that compassion to our own brothers and sisters, which will be able to gather together again soon. I promise. God bless you, and thank you for joining us.